Good evening and welcome to Resistance TV. My name is Sian Bloor and I'm the host for this evening. Tonight I'm going to be joined by David Miller and Tony Greenstein, and we're going to be talking about the ongoing situation in Ukraine and the historical consequences that have led to this horrific conflict. War doesn't just happen overnight. War is ugly, it's chaotic and it's bloody. Millions of innocent people get caught up in that war and it's not their fault. However, war isn't just about the fighting and the killing. It's about controlling the narrative on the world stage, which we talked to Rod Driver about last week. It's not for us to take sides in war. This isn't a game of whose team you're on. And tonight, we'd like to address some of the straw man arguments that we're seeing across social media. Hi, David. Are you there?
Hello. Yeah, I'm here.
Hi, David. Welcome back to Resist TV. I'd like to start by asking you to place the current situation we're in by telling us how we got here in the first place.
That's a big question. So I suppose there's two answers to that question that I would want to give you. One is the big answer, which is US imperialism and NATO expansion, which I think people on the left have rehearsed reasonably well, although of course there seems to be a bit of a dispute about this on some parts of the left, so some surprising parts of the left perhaps. But of course this comes about because of NATO's obsession with expanding towards the Russian border. They said not an inch, and they've gone very many miles towards the Russian border, including, of course, in the three Baltic states, which are all along the Russian border, and now attempting to bring Ukraine into NATO, an effort they've been engaged in since about 2005, 2006. If you look back at the attempts to set up pro-NATO clubs in the Ukraine. So that's the big picture, and some small bits within that, of course, are the colour revolutions, which swept Eastern Europe after the fall of the Soviet Union. Of course, in 2004, there was the Orange Revolution in Ukraine, where they pursued the kinds of pro-EU, pro-NATO policies that we're now seeing the result of. And then more obviously and more catastrophically, the coup against the elected government. Let's emphasize this: the elected government of Yanukovych. And the coup was something which happened, as everybody knows, I think, don't they? Which happened as a result of the mobilization of the far right, the right sector, the Azov battalions, the C-14, all of them, all these people, right? C4, sorry. But it wasn't just the mobilization of the far right which caused the coup in Euromaidan in 2014. It was a Western, I'm using the word advisedly here, a Western plot. And we know this from the transcripts and the evidence which have come out in the trials of those accused of the shootings, the killings of those protesters, 50 odd, maybe more than that, protesters in Euromaidan, including lots of cops who were killed. They killed the cops and they killed also the protesters, the anti-government protesters. And that this was done as a provocation to try and get rid of the president. And they succeeded. The president left the next day. They tried to assassinate the president on his way out. They didn't manage that because his car was empty and he'd gone a different way. And the people who were involved in this plot, you'll be unsurprised to learn, were foreign mercenaries who were allegedly, according to reports from the trials, under the command or the inference of a senior special forces US military officer. Now, this is something which not even the revolutionary left is talking about as much as they should. This was a coup planned by the US, and I mean they said, and these statements are publicly available, we will not get rid of him until we get 100 people dead. They said that to the far right, and the far right said, okay, well, we'll kill 100 people then, and they tried, didn't quite get there, I think, in that particular day. And so that's what happened. They got rid of the government. They brought in Zelensky, this guy who is, of course, as everyone knows, a comedian who starred in this program called Servant of the People, sponsored by the owner of the channel and his great mentor, Igor Kolomoisky, Zionist Ukrainian oligarch who has citizenship in Cyprus, the Ukraine, and Israel, which of course, as lots of people will know, is illegal, but nevertheless he has that. And then when that program was successful, they created a political party called Servant of the People, and then they ran that in the elections. I mean, it's a fictional narrative, and there we are. That's what's come to pass. We now have Zelensky as the president, and so that's the big picture. This is a provocation by the West, and what do people think was going to happen? Well, if they'd listened to John Mearsheimer or Noam Chomsky, or indeed our comrade Henry Kissinger, they would have known perfectly well what was going to happen. And they, in fact, were warning about this. The American security sources were warning about this at the end of last year. So, we've got what they wanted, obviously, which is a war. But you wanted to ask, I think you wanted me to answer a different question than I've just answered, which is something about the history.
Yeah, let's just take a few. Let's just take a few of those things and let's get into a little bit of more detail now. You've given us sort of an overall synopsis of how we've got to where we are. So there was a coup in Maidan in 2014. Can you go into a bit more detail as to who was behind that coup, some of the actors that were behind that coup, and who were backing them, and who those actors were backing in the Ukraine? We know that people like Biden, John McCain, Victoria Nuland were all behind the scenes during the 2014 coup d'etat, and is it coincidentally that they're back again in power, and we have those same actors who have now been behind the Zelensky presidency?
Well, again, that's a very complicated question, but let's keep on the question of Kolomoisky, the Ukrainian oligarch who I've mentioned already, who funded and whose protege is Zelensky. Now, Kolomoisky, of course, is an oligarch who owned television channels, but he also owned Privat Bank, from which he, according to FBI investigations, defrauded $5 billion worth of resources. And he also owned some oil and gas companies, one of which, Burisimo, was employed Hunter Biden, Joe Biden's son, and also a number of other, at least one other key Democrat advisor was employed by this company. Now that's a significant thing, but the underlying problem was that the Ukrainian state, in the context of Euromaidan, was weak, and when the provinces of Donetsk and Luhansk kicked off as a result of the coup, the military would have collapsed, and the people who were seeking for self-determination in Donbass would have been able to win much more effectively than they did. And so as a result, what happened was that the oligarchs created their own private militia. Kolomoisky in Dnipro, where he was drafted in as the governor in that period, created a couple of battalions. He also funded the Ida Battalion and the Azov Battalion, the organizations now known by everybody to be actual Nazis. And the right sector was also involved. Now, these were battalions which went and fought against the secessionists in the Donbass, but also were engaged in the Maidan protests. The right sector in particular was engaged in the Maidan process, and it appears from the trial records that they were involved directly in the shooting of protesters from the Ukraine Hotel in Kyiv, in the north there, you can see on the map. So there's been a kind of conglomeration of different interests here, which has allowed the far right to grow and to become established, to engage in actual violence and murders which have gone unpunished, entirely unpunished. And they're now, of course, integrated into the Ukrainian military. And and of course, everyone's seen, haven't they, the extraordinary number of photographs of Ukrainian military personnel sporting Nazi black sun emblems, and the Azov emblems, and the C4 emblem, the Sikh battalion, which is associated with C4. So everybody can see this. Now, of course, one of the things people on the left say, well, is there's only a few Nazis, and there's Nazis everywhere, and it's just like we have Nazis in the UK. The Russians have got Nazis. I mean, so it's not really any different. But of course, the Nazis in this country haven't been integrated officially into the British military. They haven't engaged in killings of tens of scores of people, of protesters, never mind the people in Donetsk and Luhansk who have been killed. It said 14,000 over the last 8 years. And so that is a significant problem. And the reason I say this is a significant problem is because not just because we now face actual Nazis, but because of the reason that we say that these are actual Nazis. And that is the history of Ukrainian nationalism, which I can go into if you would like me to.
Yes, obviously. We've got a few clips as well that we're going to play. We're going to keep them muted, so David, you can sort of talk over the top and tell us exactly what's going on there.
Sure.
But we've got a few clips here that you sent us earlier to show people exactly who the Azov Battalion are and the far right that are have been amalgamated into the Ukrainian army.
Yeah, this is a big story, right? So Ukrainian nationalism goes back a long way, and let's start the story with the Bolshevik Revolution, with the rise of the idea of Ukrainian independence and of Ukrainian nationalism. And that kind of nationalism was a nationalism which was involved, if you look at Zionist sources today, was involved in pogroms against the Jews in the 1920s. Now, I'll maybe come back to that in a minute. What we see here is a current day demonstration. Note, this is a demonstration which is being broadcast by Radio Free Liberty, i.e. by US government propaganda. So even they, when they broadcast this, saw this as a problem. This is a torchlit Nazi demonstration in commemoration of Stepan Bandera. Now, Bandera was the leader of the Ukrainian nationalists who became the leader after the period of the 1920s, in the 1930s and 40s, and who led the Ukrainian nationalists into collaboration with the German Nazi Party and the German forces. So that they collaborated in the Ukraine with the Germans, and indeed they carried out massacres for the Germans in the alliance with the Germans of Romanis and of Poles. People that they regarded as, and the word they would have used at the time was Untermensch, along with Jews. So there is a tradition in Ukrainian nationalism which is very Nazi adjacent, is actually Nazi. They collaborated with the Nazis in the 1930s and 40s. And just to leap back to the 1920s, the Ukrainian nationalists then were of a far right variety too. They were involved, as even Zionist sources would say today, in pogroms against the Jews. One of their leaders was a guy called Simon Petliura, who, if you Google his name and the word pogrom, you'll come up with Times of Israel and Haaretz pieces about how he was involved in pogroms resulting in the deaths of 30 or 50,000 Jews in the 1920s. Now, Petliura was then killed, assassinated in the street I think in Montparnasse, if I'm not mistaken. He's in Montparnasse Cemetery, along with, as some of your viewers will know, along with Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir. And he was assassinated by a Jewish Russian anarchist, who, as Tony reminded me before we came on air, was found not guilty of the crime. So this is a guy who was a pioneer of the idea of Ukrainian nationalism, but he was also a supporter of Zionism, right? And that sounds very curious, right? But he was a supporter of Zionism in the following sense. Zionism effectively comes from the Ukraine, not only, but it originates in the Ukraine. The forerunners of the Zionist movement, set up in 1881, the initial conference in 1884, was an organization called Havevi Zion, the Lovers of Zion, which was set up by a guy called Leon Pinsker. And there's an organization in this country today, recently formed, called the Pinsker Center, which indicates the kind of provenance of that organization. And Pinsker set up this organization in Odessa, where he was from. And Odessa has been referred to as the gates of Zion. It is, of course, in the south west of Ukraine, just
And that
to
was
the west.
also the home of Jabotinsky as well, wasn't it, Odessa?
I was coming on to that, yes.
Oh, sorry.
Also the home of Vladimir Jabotinsky, the leader of the revisionist Zionists, lionized in Israel, the spiritual inspiration for the Irgun and the Stern Gang, the terrorist organizations which were involved in bombings in this country, in the UK, as well as, of course, the killings and ethnic cleansing of Palestinians in the Nakba, along with the mainstream, what became the Israel Defense Forces, the Haganah. And there are, in Israel today, there are thousands of streets and hotels and hospitals and etc. named after Jabotinsky. Right? And Jabotinsky was mates, not personally, but he was a supporter of Petliura. There's even a moment he says, let it be, you can put this on my gravestone. Here lies the man who made the agreement with Petliura, right? The one who did the pogroms. Now, so that's an interesting thing. Now, if you look at this a little bit, and there's stuff on the internet about this. Petliura was a Ukrainian nationalist, and he believed in a kind of racist sense of what Ukrainian nationality was, and just in the way that you see that with in today's far right in Ukraine. And he had agreed with Jabotinsky that it was appropriate to set up Jewish military formations in the Ukraine. Right? They would have self-determination in the Ukraine. He came to that position, which is a Zionist position, with the single exception that when they fought the Russians, they had to be united. They couldn't be split then. They could do whatever they wanted before, apart from that. But when they fought the Russians, they had to be on the same side. And that sort of alliance there really prefigures much of what Zionism is about, which is about a Jews-only homeland. Where Jews have more rights than everybody else, which has more than a passing similarity to that form of Ukrainian nationalism. Now, not all Zionists were fans of Petliura or indeed of the later far right in Ukrainian politics. Golda Meir, the prime minister of Israel, who was Ukrainian, and 5 prime ministers or presidents of Israel have been Ukrainian. 2 heads of the Israel Defense Forces have been Ukrainian. So there's been a division on Ukraine in Zionism to some extent on this, but it's really remarkable that sense of what nationality means and self-determination means between the Ukrainian nationalists and the Zionists, and that's because these were similar sets of ideas, and they were in alliance with each other, and that's the extraordinary thing. Now, since the coup, just to whip up to date a bit, since the coup in 2016, there's a school in Odessa which was named after Jabotinsky in 2016 as a result of the kind of rightward drift after the coup, and that's an indication of the kind of politics that there are on amongst Zionists in the Ukraine. It's not the only kind of politics, and I want to come back to that to illustrate to you with one of the other videos that there are some divisions amongst Zionists on the far right in Ukraine, but there's a strong parallel there between Ukrainian nationalism and Zionism, which is a historical thing which goes back 100 years.
Okay, David, should we bring in Tony Greenstein and we can talk a bit more about the historical stuff, and then we'll come back to modern day and we can talk a bit more about the Kolomoisky connections today. Hi, Tony. Thanks so much for joining us. This is a subject. The reason why it's sort of come up is that we keep hearing things about, oh, there can't be a far right. There's no such thing as Nazis in the Ukraine. Zelensky's a Jew, I think this is a completely straw man argument. And in the great words of that poet Sean Ryder, it's twisting my melon, man. I can't get my head around this at all, and I was hoping that you could bring a bit of clarity to my thoughts and to other people's thoughts as to why there is this collaboration of Nazis and a Jewish president.
I mean, I can't answer individually for Zelensky, and David Miller knows far more about him than me. But historically, I mean, Zionism has never had any objection to anti-Semitism. On the contrary, without anti-Semitism, there is no Zionism. I mean, David mentioned Leon Pinsker, who, as he says, came from Odessa. And Pinsker wrote a pamphlet called Auto-Emancipation, which you may have heard of. And he said, what is Judeophobia? That he was a doctor, so he described it as an illness. And he said, Judeophobia is a hereditary disease. And having been inherited for 2,000 years, it's incurable. I mean, if something is incurable, then there's not much point in fighting it, is there? At best, you have a palliative. You treat the symptoms because there is no cure. That was a Zionist attitude to anti-Semitism. Everybody who's non-Jewish carries around this virus in them, and it may be latent, it may be come to the surface, but it's there, and so you have to accept it. It's one of the natural laws almost of nature that Jews will attract anti-Semitism because they are Jews. They never ask why that may be so. They don't ascribe it to the social, economic, political circumstances, and therefore, if it's inevitable and inherent in every non-Jew, then it's best to try and strike a deal with it. And Jabotinsky, of course, who reached this agreement, it was actually with Maxim Slavinsky, who was the representative of Petliura. Incidentally, Petliura killed far more, his Ukrainian nationalists killed far more than 30 to 50,000. Estimates go up to 200,000. And likewise, Stepan Bandera, the organization of Ukrainian nationalists, was heavily involved in the first massive massacre of Jews at Babi Yar in Kyiv, when over 33,000, 34,000 were murdered in total during the whole war. Something like 100,000, not just Jews, Romanis, communists, others were massacred in this ravine. And the OUN played an integral part in it. They were enthusiastic. I mean, Ukraine, in many ways, was the reservoir of Jews in Eastern Europe. There was something like 2 million. I mean, its boundaries consistently shifted because Ukraine wasn't independent at all. It was, I think, part of it was annexed to Poland, part of it was Russia, and so on. So it's had a very fragmented history. But Ukrainian nationalism, for a number of reasons, has always been a very rightward-looking movement. And anti-Semitism has come very naturally to it as a result. So why Zelensky? Well, it's the job of Zionism usually to kosher anti-Semitism, if I can put it like that. Zionism has no real objection to anti-Semitism because it understands anti-Semitism. Indeed, Jacob Klatskin, who was one of the early theoreticians, put it that if we object to the rightfulness of anti-Semitism, then we also have to object to the rightfulness of our own nationalism, because that's how they saw it. They understood the anti-Semites' objection to Jews. The anti-Semites objected to Jews, who they considered to be unwelcome guests in someone else's hotel, and likewise today they object to guests in their hotel, that is, refugees who aren't Jewish. So you have the absurd situation that non-Jewish, I mean, they welcome Ukrainian Jews because they're ready to become settlers in the occupied territories, but they certainly don't want non-Jewish Ukrainians. So that they dreamed up this scheme. I think it's been so notorious they've dropped it now. But it was a scheme where if you were a refugee coming from Ukraine, you had to pay a 10,000 shekel deposit, which is about £2,500. And you had to guarantee, basically, your sponsor had to guarantee you'd only be there for a month. Otherwise, you might forfeit it. So, and the reason is because in Israel, the major question is a demographic question. Who is born in the middle of the night? Are they Arab? Are they Jewish? Because it's a Jewish state, and the Jewish state must have a Jewish majority. And so people say, quite rightly, Ayelet Shaked, who's the interior minister, she makes Priti Patel look like a liberal almost. She's quite clear, you're not wanted if you're not Jewish. It doesn't really matter who you are, because you're diluting the racial gene pool, and Israel was set up precisely in order to provide as pure a Jewish society as possible. And anyone who lives there who's not Jewish is a second or third class citizen by default. I mean, it's quite clear the Jewish nation state law does that. So it's not surprising. But in Ukraine itself, I mean, Zelensky is acting to kosher the neo-Nazis. You know, he is the ideal poster boy in a way for the Azov Battalion, because he actually legitimizes them. And so he's playing, every TV host points, when anyone mentions neo-Nazis in Ukraine, they say, well, they've got a Jewish president. I mean, he is in the ideal position to do that. But it's true that, I mean, every country, I mean, Russia has it. Putin is certainly not clean. He doesn't. There are right-wing nationalists who control the two breakaway republics. They're not pretty places at all. Let's be quite honest about that. But in Ukraine, you have a situation, not simply that you have Nazi militias or groups, but they're integrated into the very forces of the state. They have access to weapons and arms. And in Odessa in 2016, I think it was the right sector and the fascists burnt out a trade union centre and literally burnt alive 41 trade unionists.
Yep.
That's right, yeah.
Because the trade unions obviously are the first targets for fascists. So it's not simply a question of, well, everyone's got them. And the Congress in the end of 2015, withdrew a measure which had been introduced 6 months earlier by two Democrats, which prevented funds going to neo-Nazi groups. So the Congress was quite aware of what they were doing. It was at the instigation of the Pentagon. So we have the US military, the British military, and the Israeli military as well, all supplying to one degree and another, not only weapons training and funding, but working alongside almost the Azov Battalion, the right sector militias, the Bandera Battalion, and many others of these. So that's why it's quite unique. Of course, support for the fascists in the population as a whole is not particularly high. That's absolutely true. But it's the power of these groups. And Zelensky, in essence, is their puppet. I mean, Zelensky, when he went down to the Donbass and met with the Azov and basically told them to keep it quiet, he was sent away with a flea in his ear. I mean, there was talk of assassinating him and so on. So, I mean, he bowed down to that. I mean, as I say, David knows much more about Zelensky as an individual, but that's the situation in the Ukraine. I mean, David mentioned Odessa. I mean, Odessa, it has a very checkered history. It was a center of the Jewish Enlightenment, Haskalah, and that's where Zionism really came from, because it was after the pogroms in Odessa in 1871, and then with the assassination of Alexander II in 1881, massive pogroms broke out, and the Jewish intellectuals jackknifed into Zionism. They despaired of ever winning over. And that was really, as David says, the birthplace of Zionism, Chovevei Zion under Leon Pinsker. And actually, that was the first settlement of Palestine. The Biluim in 1882 went out to establish the first settlements in Palestine. There were one or two, Petah Tikva in particular. It's a
David, do you want to come back in there?
But David,
well, I'm sure Tony knows much more about this than I do, but I did note just the other day that this sect, Chabad
Lubavitch, yes,
they created a settlement in Hebron in 1816, And indeed, I think another settlement in what's now within 48 Israel in 1780 or so. Now that wasn't; these weren't Zionist settlements
No, they
by any
wouldn't have
means,
been. No.
but they were settlements, and they became part of the settler movement today. Still are part of the settler movement today. I think that's an interesting sort of prehistory to the whole question of Zionism, because Zionist settlements, as you say, Tony, started when in the late 1800s, but in the first Aliyah, as it's called. But there were other settlements there before.
There may well have been, but I mean, Chabad, I don't know how strong it was. It's much stronger now, but it wouldn't have been a Zionist settlement.
No. I mean, they were until very recently an anti-Zionist sect.
Lubavitch is a strange creature in many ways.
Can we come back to the Chabad sect in a little bit, because I think it's probably something that's fairly new to people, and I think we do need to explain that, who they are and what they believe in a little bit more detail. So if we just if we go back to David now, and we can talk a bit more about the Azov Battalion. You sent me a clip here on Ukraine's Azov Regiment opening boot camps for kids. Gaz, can you play clip 2 for us, please? Okay, so let's talk a little bit more now about Kolomoisky. So you started to tell us about Kolomoisky, and he was this oligarch, made his riches from ill-gotten gains, and Zelensky became a billionaire, didn't he? I mean, how does an actor become a billionaire? Let's start there, and you can tell us a little bit more about that story.
I mentioned before this show. I mean, he was a comedian, and they had this show called Servant of the People. I guess people know about this now. And he played the role of this teacher who goes on this rant in class about the corruption of the political class, and one of his students records it, and it goes viral on the internet, and he becomes elected president. And then, of course, in real life, he stops being a comedian and he's elected president. And a party is formed with the name of the TV series. And of course, both are funded by Kolomoisky. It's on Kolomoisky's channel. Kolomoisky relentlessly promotes Zelensky in the election process, including on the election day, 7.5 hours of programming featuring Zelensky in contravention of all the laws on election broadcasting, of course. And so he makes Zelensky. And Zelensky and his wife and his advisors create these offshore shell companies to launder some of the ill-gotten gains which Kolomoisky has defrauded from somewhere. I don't know which particular ill-gotten gains they were. And these are featured in the Bandera papers, and you can read about this online, that these shell companies were put there to receive money from Kolomoisky to Zelensky and his inner circle. The shares or the beneficial interest in some of these companies was then transferred from Zelensky to his closest advisor, who was appointed a presidential advisor when he became president, and that meant that he didn't have any beneficial interest in these companies. But later documents, as revealed by the Bandera papers, show that it was also the case that his wife retained a beneficial interest, in the sense that she would be getting the dividends from the companies from the special advisor to the president, who still was the beneficial owner of these companies. So, I mean, deeply, deeply, deeply corrupt, right? But that, of course, is only the beginning. I mean, I mentioned before, of course, the employment of Hunter Biden through the oil company, which Kolomoisky was the controller of, but his biggest, as I understand, his biggest fraudulent activity was in relation to Private Bank, which had a branch in one of the Baltic republics and in Cyprus, and they laundered money which had been stolen from Private Bank into those branches, and then it was then laundered further afield. And I'll come back to that in a second. Now, as a result of that, Private Bank collapses and it has to be nationalized, and so the taxpayers in Ukraine have to bail out to the tune of $5 billion or something like that, which of course is a little bit problematic. and renders the country even poorer, more into crisis than it already was. Now, but where does all this other money go? Well, Kolomowski is not just an oligarch, not just engaged in what appears to be massive fraud on the public sector and the Ukrainian industry, but he's also a philanthropist, of course, and so he gives money to good causes, and you can hear the inverted commas around the phrase "good causes," right? Including, of course, being the patron of the biggest Chabad center in the world, also apparently, allegedly, the biggest Jewish community center in the world, which is in Dnipro, which is where he was the governor in 2014 and raised his own battalions, his own militias, which he used to enforce his own business interests as well as to fight the Russians or the Russian separatists. So where does the money go to? Well, one of the places the money goes to, millions and millions of dollars, was into a whole range of charities and real estate in Florida and New York. Now, the charities were all charities associated with the Chabad movement, which we'll come back to explain what that is. And then there's two guys in the Chabad movement who are leaders of that movement in Florida, who live in massive mansions in Florida, who have been investigated by the FBI and the IRS in the US. Kolomowski and his family, all of his family members specifically, are banned from traveling to the US. And these other guys, are specifically named in the Department of Justice cases. There's 4 separate cases against them for fraud and which involves real estate fraud and all sorts of other financial goings on. So there's something really quite significant there, I think, because we see the Chabad movement appears to be part of this money laundering operation. Not just that they were recipients, but they were actively part, according to the Department of Justice, part of this money laundering operation. Now, what is the Chabad movement? Do we need to go into that now in order to understand?
Yes, please do. Yeah.
So, Chabad Lubavitch is a Jewish sect, I suppose is the word, which comes from Lubavitch. The name Lubavitch is after the place where it sort of originated, which is a small village in Russia, very near the Belarusian border, called Lubavitchy, and I'm sure I've pronounced that wrongly. They have a series of chief rabbis, the Rebbe as they called him. I think 7 of them altogether, and the last one, who died in 1994, was born in Mykolaiv, just to the east of Odessa in Ukraine. And it's a messianic sect which believes in converting people and in going out amongst the non-ultra-Orthodox Jews and bringing Jews into religious observance, but also in converting other people and sort of doing ministering to the non-Jews, right? But it also has a peculiar set of beliefs, which is that they believe that the Jews are the chosen people, that Jews are superior to other people, that non-Jews don't have human souls, and all that kind of stuff. That's the kind of stuff which is a little bit bizarre, but you think no more of it if it's just a religious sect, perhaps. But actually, what we find in the contemporary period is that Chabad Lubavitch has become very influential. They have some 10,000 emissaries, or shluchim, as they call them, around the world in 100 countries. They are the dominant force in the Jewish community in Ukraine, and indeed in Russia, it seems, which is a place from which they came. They're very active in the US, in the UK, and a number of other countries where they have a lot of emissaries doing this.
I know, and Trump was surrounded by Chabad Lubavitch rabbis, and
Putin,
I think indeed his son-in-law was. His son-in-law gave a lot of money to Chabad causes.
So they're kind of an influential sect, and as I mentioned before, and Tony kind of grimaced at this. They sort of were regarded as being anti-Zionist until about 67 or so, when the Rebbe in charge kind of came to an accommodation with Zionism, which meant that they're anti-Zionist in the sense that they don't believe that the state of Israel has the power to take Jews out of the land of Israel. They believe Jews should have the right to be there regardless of the state of Israel making peace deals. And so they're kind of anti-Zionist organization, kind of, and the Rebbe makes his peace with Zionism, and they support the IDF and the territories and all that kind of thing date. And in fact, they're very central to the radical settler movement. So, I mean, you can look this up in Haaretz or the Times of Israel, even who report it, that the Chabad settlers, people in the settlements who are Chabad, are strongly involved in price tag attacks. That is revenge attacks on Palestinians. The Shin Bet, which is Israel's equivalent of MI5, say that almost all revenge attacks, price tag attacks against Palestinians, are done by people from Chabad. I mean, extraordinary. So it's not only that they've got this kind of sense of Jews as being superior, but also that they believe in an ultra settler definition that you can go around and you can attack Palestinians, or Arabs as they would call them, because that's what they're due. They're due to be attacked, and they even go to the lengths in some of their published work. For example, the King's Torah, written by two rabbis from one of the Chabad settlements, talks about how it's legitimate to kill children, because Palestinian children, non-Jewish children, because they will grow up to be extremists. This is a really rather grim set of ideas and practices which they put into place.
Very extreme. In my opinion.
I can just finish one more thing to say about that. And of course, they've been involved with the extremes of the settler movement for some time. When Rabbi Meir Kahane was in the US, and eventually, of course, he traveled to Israel and was assassinated. When he was in the US, he set up the Jewish Defense League, which, as everyone knows, was designated by the FBI as a terrorist organization. And he was involved because he was regarded as being an extremist. He had a problem with raising money for his movement. And so Chabad stepped up and they laundered the money from the States back to Israel, according to a key book written about this period. So there's a very murky sort of relationship there between the kind of settlement project and money laundering for those kinds of activities.
Tony, just briefly, if you want to come back on that, and then we need to bring Lizzie in to see if we've had any questions in the chat.
Yes, okay. I mean, Chabad Lubavitch reminds me in many ways of the happy clappy kind of wing of the evangelicals.
I wouldn't call them happy. I wouldn't call them happy clappy, but they are extremists in my view.
Well, in the sense that they minister to non-religious Jews in order to get them to come within their orbit, and they are quite successful in that. As David said, they have a lot of money. They're very influential. The third president of Israel was a supporter of Lubavitch. They're incredibly influential. Their anti-Zionism was actually Agudat Yisrael, which is always represented in the Israeli parliament, the Knesset, is formally anti-Zionist, but because Israel isn't a halachic, a religious theocratic state, but that doesn't mean they're not equally, if not more so, racist than the average Zionist. I mean, their book Hatanya is full of what David said, but you know, if you're non-Jewish, you don't have a soul, or you have the soul of an animal. And the result of that, of course, is that there are two penalties. If you kill a Jew, I mean, that's a capital offense. But if you kill a non-Jew, well, God will deal with you. But it's not so great a problem. And David mentioned the King's Torah, Torah HaMelech. It was brought out by two rabbis, Yitzhak Shapiro and I think it was David Elitzor in 2009. And it was a religious legal treatise on how you can kill non-Jews legally. And he said, well, the way to offend or to wound the wicked king is to kill his children, because that is going to mortally affect him, you know. And you can think about the morality of you kill someone's children in order to get at them, but that was what was running through. But secular Israelis and Palestinians, etc., protested about this and said, you can't just let it go. But, you know, the state refused to prosecute. And indeed, when two of the rabbis were called in for questioning, including Dov Lior, who is the chief rabbi, in essence, of the West Bank, he's a vehement racist who said that a Jewish fingernail is worth more than 1,000 non-Jews. There was another Lubavitch rabbi who upped it to 1 million non-Jewish lives. So there you go, a Jewish fingernail.
Well, I think we could go on and on actually with this conversation, particularly
Yes.
about the Noahide laws, but I won't go there just at the moment because that's another subject in itself. Thanks, Tony and Dave, for that. Let's see if we've got any comments. Lizzie, do you want to come back to us?
Hi, everybody.
Hi, how's it going in the chat room?
Well, everybody's full of chat, and there are a lot of people watching tonight. I'm sure they're incensed by the absolute lies put out by Western media, and they're very interested in hearing about the truth. And it was Adolf Eichmann, I think, who said, in order to destroy a nation, it is necessary to destroy first of all children. And I've put a link into the chat to the video for that, where a journalist on Ukraine TV states that he allows himself to quote the words of Adolf Eichmann, and that he will kill all the Russian children. So, you know, it's horrific, really. Sigafredo said, as I mentioned before, in Chile and Argentina, for example, Henry Kissinger supported the far-right death squads in South America, and we know who Henry Kissinger was. Same thing in Ukraine. Was it the same thing in Ukraine?
What's the question, Lizzie? Was it just a comment he made, or was it a question?
Yeah, no, I don't know. Gaz started it. So,
oh, right.
I don't know.
Looking on that, I mean, the extraordinary thing about this is that Henry Kissinger is on the other side of this argument. I mean, you know, imagine being so far to the right that Henry Kissinger is your opponent. It's extraordinary. Henry Kissinger agrees with Noam Chomsky, agrees with John Mearsheimer. I mean, that's amazing.
Yeah. Right, well, there you go then. At least you knew the answer to that question that I didn't know how to put. Thanks, Gaz. Yeah, not many black children in that Ukrainian summer camp video. Do you want to talk a little bit about the racism?
Sure. I mean, people have seen this, haven't they? They wouldn't let the black people out. We'll let white people leave, but we're not going to let black people out. As I understand it, I mean, subject to this being empirically verified, I think it's the case that one of the only places where civilians were able to get out through one of the humanitarian corridors, which the Russians proposed setting up, was in the north in Sumy, where, as I understand it, the reason that the Ukrainians had to let them out was because they had a riot. And this is largely African and other people of color rioting, saying, no, we're going. And they had to let them out. In other places, all of these humanitarian corridors appear to have been interrupted in some way. I don't want to say any more about that just now, but in that particular case, it seems that, you know, they were deliberately selecting people who could leave on the grounds of their race. And of course, let's not forget that they were sending back anyone who is white and male and able-bodied, and not letting them leave either. We've seen lots of stories, haven't we, of people joining the Foreign Legion to fight for Ukraine, and they have not found what they thought they were going to get. The stories about passports being cut up, people being sent to Kyiv with no guns or the like. I mean, that's not really very pleasant for them. It's not really what they thought they were doing.
Yeah. No, and I believe the Israelis have sent a unit over there to help out. Is that correct?
Well, I mean, that's what we should talk about as well. The Tavor rifles, made by a subsidiary of Elbit Systems, or at least they used to be made by a subsidiary of Elbit Systems. I think it's now been sold off to another company. Anyhow, these are Israeli rifles. And if you look at the Azov Battalion's, the Azov Regiment's YouTube, you can see the Azov lot posing about with Israeli rifles. The Ukrainian military have been trained by ex-IDF people in their training schools, including near Dnipro. And of course, many Israelis have arrived to fight on the Ukrainian side, according to Israeli press reports. So we've seen a significant involvement of the Israelis in the actual conflict.
But I hear also that there is a significant influx of far right from across Europe as well, and even as far as, you know, as Canada and America have been flying in there. I think it's been a complete magnet for the far right in Ukraine, and one of the things that. Sorry, Lizzie.
So not only that, but Israel giving respite to people, Jews coming from Ukraine are able to travel to Israel, and they're sending jets to pick them up.
Yeah.
Sure. So they can use them, as Tony said, so they can become settler colonists. The World Zionist Organization, I think, or the Jewish Agency, said that they had 1,000 units, mobile settlement units. I'm not quite sure what that means, but that means that, you know, that they're going to. These people are welcome with open arms as long as they can contribute to the number of Jews that there are in Israel, which can outnumber the Palestinians. That's the whole rationale and the whole point of all of this. Always has been the whole point of all the immigration. From
and unlike the Ethiopian Jews, they're high quality.
Yes, we've seen the treatment of some of the Ethiopian Jews have managed to make it to any safe country. They have any black people have been terribly treated in all the countries that they've reached. We've got also from Julius Marstrand, Mila Kunis, a Ukrainian emigre living in America, and Ashton Kutcher had dinner with Zelensky on at least one occasion in 2019. They apparently raised 13 million for Zelensky's election campaign. How is money raised in America allowed to be used for an election in Ukraine? He asks. That's going back a bit to 2014, of course. I guess.
David, do you have any answer for that?
I don't know what the laws are, no, but I mean, you know, evidently it's the case that there's a lot of money behind Zelensky because he was the West's candidate in the election. You know, I mean, it's amazing, isn't it? I mean, if you look at the maps that are online about the proportion of people who voted for Zelensky, he's a Russian speaker, and people voted for him more in the east, in the Russian-speaking part of Ukraine, than in the West, which, given he's the West's candidate, indicates that they didn't really understand what was happening. That he was presented in such a way that people thought that he was some kind of unity candidate, that he was a Russian speaker, that he would tackle corruption and take on the oligarchs, which of course he was being put in by in the first place. So that was a mistake.
Sorry, Lizzie, can I just get this question in? One of the straw man arguments that I keep hearing and is on social media is, oh, Putin's worse than Hitler. How would you answer that, Tony?
Yes. Well, we've had a number of new Hitlers, haven't we? Started with Gamal Abdel Nasser, and it went on. I mean, Yasser Arafat was a new Hitler, Saddam Hussein was a new Hitler, and of course Putin. It really just saves you having to think very much if you keep painting your enemies as the new Hitler. It makes no sense. I mean, Putin isn't a particularly attractive character. I mean, Russia is a kind of gangster capitalist state in many ways, but the war itself is being fought for really defensive purposes because of the encroachment of NATO. I mean, I don't think we should. Yes, I mean, Putin, as I say, is not a progressive in any sense whatsoever. But if you ask who's killed more people, I think that's probably Joe Biden rather than Putin. So if the analogy with Hitler has any meaning, then I suspect it belongs in Washington, not Moscow.
Yeah, the just for interest, we did get some figures from the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights on how many people had been killed in the Donbass region. And they confirm that there was over 14,000 who've already lost their lives in that conflict, and around 50 to 70,000 who have had non-fatal injuries. So, you know, there's been a hell of a lot of people, thousands who've been injured over there in the last 8 years. And most of them are actually ethnic Russians, aren't they? Yeah.
The Russian-speaking Ukrainians, that's for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Anything else, Lizzie?
Yeah, it was generally just how can we find out honest information with Facebook allowing Putin death threats or death threats against Russian people, regardless of who they are. I mean, once people see that they're allowed to make death threats against Russians, they're not going to stop at Putin, are they, or whoever they don't like? So how are we ever going to get, you know, like every time I see a video, I think, oh, can I put that out? Because it's like the journalist advocating killing Russian children. I'm like, well, Russia believes that the Ukrainians are Nazis generally, so they would be quite happy for me to put that out. Zionist Israel has a huge amount of interest in this conflict, as well as the UK. How do we information?
Sorry, Lizzie, we're losing you a bit now.
David, how do we get honest information?
Well, I mean, it's very difficult, isn't it? This war is sort of unprecedented. I mean, in my memory, anyhow. I remember walking up the road in Glasgow in 1982 as the order was given to sail for the South Atlantic, and thinking they can't be this stupid. And the Falklands seems like a walk in the park compared to the atmosphere that there is in this country against Putin, the Russophobia, that there is the calling out of anybody who questions anything. I mean, the attack on Stop the War, you know, Stop the War's position on this, you can dispute or you can argue with, but the attack on Stop the War as a phenomenon itself is extraordinary. That the idea that Stop the War is a pro-Russian front is completely ridiculous, of course. But there is no proper analysis of this, and it really is very much like what it reminds me of is what I think it must have been like in the run-up to the First World War, where, you know, all of the left parties in the whole of Europe said, "We'll working class first, international solidarity," until the moment when they were tested, and most of the left collapsed in that moment in Germany, in the UK, and the left, I don't think, has ever really properly recovered from that split in 1914, where, you know, national capital was favoured over internationalism. And I think that's something that's happened just now. You know, that those people who used to be on the left, you know, people only 6 months ago who probably would have been against the war in Syria even, and now are saying, you know, but you've got to do something about Putin. And it's extraordinary that the people on the left who I know who regard themselves as revolutionary socialists talking about, you can't say that there are Nazis in the Ukraine, or there's only a few Nazis, or it's not important, or and you sit and you think, well, hang on a minute, you know, what actually are we seeing here? And there's a lack of recognition of what's actually being seen here, I think, and that's a real shame for the possibilities of a humane world, I think.
Mm. Well, thanks very much. We've now reached the top of the hour. I want to thank David and Tony, and of course our Lizzie, for coming on tonight. And I think, you know, this carries on really well from our conversation that we had with Rod Driver last week, where we were talking about propaganda, and we addressed some of the issues that we have in getting the correct information and trying to find our way through some of that information. And all I can do is echo what we discussed last week. You know, try and listen to as many different sources as you can. not the BBC, not Channel 4, but some alternative sources. There are some very good alternative sources out there. John Mearsheimer, the Greys. Sorry, David, go on.
Have I got a second to make a last comment? I mean, I think
yes, you can. Yes,
yes. For big picture questions, John Mearsheimer, Noam Chomsky, even Henry Kissinger. God forbid that I ever said those words. But for the specifics, I mean, let's remember Snake Island, right, where Ukrainian soldiers were said to have been killed by the Russians or posthumously decorated, or they turned up alive in Moscow, or the mosque the other day in the south of Ukraine, which was said to have been bombed by the Russians by the Ukrainian government. The imam says, "Mate, no bombs here. It was half a mile away. There wasn't a bomb here. That was made up." And we've also seen the alleged hospital bombing, which is at the moment I would say is disputed. And we'll see several other atrocities which will turn out not to be real or not to be to have happened in the way it's said for the propaganda that they're happening. Now, how do you find out about that? You've got to check stuff. You've got to think who's saying what, when have they said it, how does this work, how does this story fit together? You've got to go and do research. Now, I try and do that. Lots of others will try and do that as well, but people can do that themselves. It's these things are visible if you look at the alternative sources and you evaluate them and you think about it. But be skeptical, but check stuff out is what I would say.
Absolutely. Great points there, David. Well, thank you everyone for watching. Don't forget to drop us a like, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and you'll be notified for when we do upload next Wednesday at 7 o'clock. And if you would like to carry on the conversation in the comments, please do drop us a comment. We do read them. So it just remains for me to say thank you all for watching. Thank you to our guests. We'll see you next week.
Thank you.